Dr. Andrea Mikalone. I hope I'm saying that right. I don't want to butcher your name. She is a veterinary epidemiologist and Mexico liaison for the California Department of Food and Agriculture. She is serving as the lead for the CDFA's response to the rabbit hemorrhagic disease outbreak that started in the American Southwest last year. She has also served as the CDFA liaison with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife with regards to RHD. And CDFA and CDFW have been working cooperatively on this outbreak. Okay, go ahead.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure, and I will really enjoy talking with you this afternoon. And I hope that in the future that I'll be able to meet y'all in person. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so many of the slides in this presentation were provided by the USDA veterinarians listed on this opening page. So I thank them. Rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus is of the genus Legovirus in the calicivirus family. It's related to the norovirus, which is a very resistant virus. So as you can imagine, that rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus is also very resistant to disinfection and very hangs around the environment for a very long time. It is a non-envelope virus, and this is one of the reasons why it is more difficult to disinfect than some other viruses like the virus that causes COVID. It can be found in the environment up to 108 days outside the rabbit, and up to 90 days in carcasses, and much longer if the carcasses are frozen. It's transmitted usually through direct contact with infected carcasses or infected rabbits, but also can be spread by fomites. So people can track it around on their shoes or on their clothing or on their hands. Also predators, scavengers, dogs, birds of prey, coyotes can also spread the virus around mechanically. It was first discovered in China in 1984. It was believed that it may have been imported in Angora rabbits from Germany. And after that, it spread to over 30 countries around the world, including Australia and New Zealand. And in 2010, RHDV2, a new strain, emerged in France, and that rapidly spread to all of Europe and the Mediterranean. That virus was found to be able to infect hares as well as European rabbits. So Italian hares and Cape hares, and also it was infecting rabbits that had been vaccinated against the original rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus. The incubation period is typically 1 to 5 days, 1 to 3 days for the original rabbit hemorrhagic disease, and 3 to 9 days for RHDV2, usually within 5 days, but experimentally up to 9 days. And mortality is pretty rapid within the first few days. It causes liver inflammation, resulting in prevention of blood clotting and hence the hemorrhaging. The most common sign is sudden death, but rabbits may also show fever, bleeding from different bodily orifices. They can have jaundice or icterus, inappetence. A lot of rabbit owners say that it kind of looks like GI stasis, which is a common affliction of rabbits. They're weak and lethargic. They won't come to the front of the cage. Also, owners have noticed that they like to hang around the water bowl quite a bit. And then towards the end, they sometimes have spasms or seizures and ophthalmos and vocalizations at the end. And also sometimes they'll have difficulty breathing. The average mortality rate that we've seen in this particular outbreak in the US is about 60%, but there's a wide range depending on the premises. And rabbits of all ages can be affected by the RHDV2, whereas the original RHDV seemed to spare the younger rabbits. So in the US, we had our first outbreak of RHDV serotype 2 in Ohio in 2018, just in a single domestic rabbit premises. Prior to that, Canada had been experiencing a couple outbreaks, first in Quebec in 2016, and then in British Columbia, especially Vancouver and the nearby areas in 2018. 2019, the Vancouver outbreak spread to Washington state, to some of the islands up there. You can see on the map there in the circle, and also some cases on the mainland. And it affected domestic rabbits as well as feral domestic rabbits in Washington. And then in New York, there was an outbreak in a vet clinic. About 14 rabbits that were being either boarded or treated at the clinic became affected. But what we're really here to talk about today is the 2020 Southwestern outbreak, which was first detected in New Mexico in March in some domestic rabbits, but they rapidly found out that it had been affecting the wild rabbits as well, perhaps for a couple months before it was detected. Also, it was found in Arizona, then Texas, and Colorado, and it spread all across the southwestern states. And there was a case in Florida in domestic rabbits believed to be connected to perhaps hay from one of the other states. Then this year, it spread to some of the more northern western states, as well as just last month, there were some cases in Georgia. So here's a map, and it has a time series showing the cases as they appeared in the US starting in 2018. So you can see there's the Ohio case. It's likely that those rabbits had been infected with a similar strain to the one that was going on in British Columbia. And then Seattle, well, actually not Seattle, but up in the islands up there in the channel, up there near the border with Canada. Then New York, and then the Southwest outbreak just exploded. So that continued, and at least in our state, our last diagnosed case was in early July of this year. Okay. Here's a map from the USDA's website, and it has all the counties that have been affected in the West. And the pink ones are counties that have just had the wildlife or feral rabbit detections, and the blue counties had domestic rabbit detections. Some of them also had wild rabbit detections, but it doesn't really show very well. In California, you can see we have most of our cases in Southern California, and with the most cases in Los Angeles and Riverside County. And we just recently, in June, had a case in a wild jackrabbit in Alameda County, so up there in the Bay Area. Also, there's 2 southeastern states that have had domestic cases. There's now been 2 counties, 2 cases in Georgia, and the 1 case in Florida. So far as we know, it has not spread to wild rabbits in these states. Simultaneously, Mexico has been having an outbreak. They first detected the disease in Chihuahua, and it also rapidly found it to have spread to Sonora. And then since then spread all throughout the northern states in Mexico, as well as central Mexico. Central Mexico is where they have their largest meat rabbit industry. So it has been a serious problem for Mexican rabbit producers, and they have developed their own vaccine. So here in the United States, we have the domestic rabbits that are affected. It's estimated that there's about between 5 and 7 million pet rabbits in the United States. In California, pet rabbits are the 3rd most popular pet after dogs and cats. And then we also have in the US a meat rabbit industry for both human and pet food consumption. And then there's still rabbits being raised for fur, Angora rabbits being raised for wool, and then there's rabbits being raised to supply the biologics and biotech industries. There's also nearly 1 million show rabbits in the United States, 4-H and FFA rabbits and other fancy rabbits. And there's a lot of rabbit rescues around, especially in California. There's quite a few, and they move rabbits around, trying to find homes for them, fostering them out to different people. So that's another way that if they're not careful, that disease can be spread. And then in the wild rabbits, we have the cottontail rabbits, we have the hares and jackrabbits, and it's possible that pikas can also be affected. So it's a complicated disease to control. It affects more than one country, and there's a wildlife involvement. Also, feral domestic rabbits are involved. So it's very unlikely that we would be able to eradicate this disease. And between the different states have different regulatory authority over rabbits. For example, Texas has no regulatory authority over rabbits, whereas Arizona, their laws actually said that they had to depopulate every single domestic premises that was affected. They were able to change their regulations later on in the outbreak. Also, USDA doesn't really have a program for rabbits, so there's no way to compensate owners if their rabbits die or if they have to be euthanized. In California, we've taken the approach that since this disease seems that it's going to be endemic and it's in the wildlife, that we are not causing the euthanasia of people's domestic rabbits, but we are placing quarantines on the premises for a minimum of 120 days after the last rabbit death. That's just to avoid moving the disease from one place to another. So there are a lot of challenges with this disease. In addition, there's a scarcity of vaccine, and I'll talk about that more later. And then not every state is able to do testing for this disease. USDA has made a coordinating cell. The lead is the strategy and policy group of USDA, and then the field ops and wildlife services, and then the laboratory and biologics sections are also very important in this. And they've been liaising with different partners, the countries of Canada and Mexico, and also the state ag departments and the state wildlife departments, as well as the industry and other stakeholders. And this is how they've been approaching this disease. And again, it's more challenging than some of the other diseases they've dealt with due to the limitations. And so a lot of it relies on outreach and promoting good biosecurity and reporting to our international partners. Also conducting epidemiological investigations to figure out how the disease is spreading and how we might better mitigate it and stop it. And then promoting the diagnostics and also looking into better accessibility for vaccines. And then as far as wild rabbit activities, continuing surveillance and data sharing, and again, promoting the laboratory testing. Here's some of the partners they've been working with. And here's an overview of the disease and the wildlife. So before this outbreak in the southwestern US, we knew that RHDV1, the original disease, affected European rabbits, both wild and domestic European rabbits of the genus Eryctolagus. But as far as we knew, it didn't affect any other species of rabbits. And there had been some experimental studies done at Plum Island where they tested eastern cottontail rabbits to see if they were able to become infected. And the data suggested that they weren't. So for a long time, that was the dogma, that rabbit hemorrhagic disease could only affect European rabbits of the genus Hemorrhagic. But with the new strain that emerged in 2010, RHDV2, it turns out that it can affect other species like the hares and the cottontails. And unfortunately, we saw that firsthand with this outbreak where it actually spread into the wild cottontails and wild jackrabbits. So here's just another picture of the variety of European domestic rabbits. So in this outbreak, we've had black-tailed jackrabbits affected, and that was our first detection in California as well, in the Palm Springs area, was in black-tailed jackrabbits. And then in the desert cottontails, we have a lot of those in California as well. Some of the other states have had deaths in the antelope jackrabbit and in the mountain cottontail. We haven't had those in our state. And then some eastern cottontails have been affected. And then most recently in our state, in Malibu, we had a western brush rabbit, Silvolagus bachmani, which was affected. In Mexico, off the coast of Sonora is an island called the Isla de Tiburon, and they have their own subspecies of antelope jackrabbit, the Tiburon antelope jackrabbit. And unfortunately, they became infected with rabbit hemorrhagic disease, virus 2, and they started dying. And we believe that they may have been infected either through birds of prey that dropped some carcasses or defecated on the island, because the virus can pass intact and still able to cause disease after passing through the GI tract of another animal. Or it's been suggested that perhaps some hikers came to the island on a boat and could have tracked it in as a fomite. In California, we have an endangered subspecies of brush rabbit, the riparian brush rabbit, which we are very concerned about. The disease has not gotten up to their habitat yet, but we've done a lot of testing to be on alert. And they have a very small population, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 animals there in the Central Valley. And so the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has partnered with some other agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Oakland Zoo, in order to vaccinate this endangered population. So last year they vaccinated 242, and then this spring they went ahead and they were going to vaccinate another 250, and I believe that they finished that. And then in the fall they're going to go back and vaccinate again. And so for that project we used the French vaccine, the Filovac vaccine. We don't know if pikas are susceptible, but it's possible that they are with their close relationship to rabbits. It's believed that the circulating rabbit caliciviruses, other rabbit caliciviruses, may provide some protection against RHDV. So this might be why in Europe, sometimes the virus doesn't spread as much, but also some rabbits will have some protection against the pathogenic effects of RHDV, but they may have their symptoms masked and they may be able to spread to other rabbits. So in Europe, they've seen a lot of disease where there's a lot of domestic rabbits raised as commercial animals, also where there's high rabbit numbers, high colony numbers of domestic rabbits. And they seem to see a seasonal spread from January to June being the highest, and then after the summer wears on, then it seems to decline. And that's what we've seen the last 2 years here in the United States. Seemed that in the late summer last year, the disease kind of slowed down, and then it reappeared at the end of the fall. And we had our last case in early July. We haven't had any new cases in wild or domestic rabbits, at least in our state. as far as I know, in other states, it's also declined. So that's what we're seeing now is the summer lull. And then we expect that probably in the fall that the disease is going to come back again. Here's some photos of domestic rabbits at Plum Island. You can see the blood-tinged fluid coming from the nose. This rabbit has pulmonary edema. The livers are generally pale with a distinct globular pattern, and they have severe hepatic necrosis and hepatic insufficiency. The animals experience a massive DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation, so there'll be blood clots and bleeding at the same time. Here you can see a normal liver on the right and an affected liver on the left. Also, they'll have pulmonary edema and congestion. The main route of infection is through the oral route. So it is important that rabbit owners be careful on their sources of hay and other feed sources that they're giving to their rabbits. Some of the early directions from USDA was to submit liver, spleen, and lung, but liver has the highest titer of virus, so now they're recommending only to send liver for diagnosis. Here's some of the differentials. Any large rabbit die-off, you've got to think of tularemia and plague and take appropriate precautions to protect yourself. And then poisoning is something that a lot of people suspect, especially rabbit owners, when they see dead rabbits that die suddenly, they think they've been poisoned. And occasionally, it's not rabbit hemorrhagic disease, it's rodenticide poisoning or something else. At the beginning, all the laboratory testing was done at Plum Island, Battle, and that was because it's a foreign animal disease. But after July 2020, they allowed state veterinarians to designate approved labs in the endemic states, and our state designated our California Animal Health and Food Safety Lab. Not every state has a lab that can do the PCR testing, so occasionally our lab gets samples from neighboring states. There's 2 national wildlife labs approved to do the testing, the USGS lab at the National Wildlife Health Center in Madison, and also the SCWIDIS lab in Georgia. When a new state is affected or a new species is affected, then the samples need to be sent from those labs to Plum Island for confirmation. That's what happened with our recent regular brush rabbit from Malibu. Necropsy alone is not diagnostic. Our first case, actually, in the jackrabbit, did not appear suspicious for rabbit hemorrhagic disease on the gross necropsy. Sometimes the animals die so fast that there aren't visible lesions. So the liver PCR is the diagnostic approved test, and it's the most sensitive. And this virus doesn't grow in cell culture, so there's no virus isolation. And our state laboratory is validating a PCR for rectal swabs and feces, and we're hoping that this will assist in diagnosis in wild populations. Sometimes it's hard to get a sample because the scavengers will eat the liver, scavenge the carcass before we get there.
Dr. Michelon, sorry, 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll wrap up quickly. So there's no licensed vaccine in the US. So the Center for Veterinary Biologics is allowing importation of vaccine from Spain and France. And only the affected states are allowed to import the vaccine. And there is a US vaccine company that is seeking approval for a brand new vaccine, and we're hoping that it might be licensed either on an emergency or conditional basis by the end of this year or early next year. And we are doing epidemiological investigations for each domestic case in order to determine the risk factors and the patterns of spread. And the whole genome sequencing has shown that the outbreak in the Southwest, as well as the 3 cases in Florida and Georgia, were part of the same outbreak, whereas the cases in Washington, Ohio, and New York were part of a separate outbreak. And we've declared ourselves to be stable endemic, at least in those states in the West, because the disease is in the wildlife and the feral rabbits. So the reporting to OIE has gone down in frequency. Instead of reporting weekly, we only have to report when we have a new state or a new species affected. USDA has a lot of outreach on their website. The most useful one for us has been the general guidance on cleaning and disinfection, dated July 2020. We give that to every affected rabbit premises owner. And then on our own CDFA webpage, we have a link to the USDA's interactive map. And we also have developed several fact sheets, both in English and Spanish, one for the disease, one for veterinary clinics specifically, and one for biosecurity, and one for rabbit show organizers. We also have placed restrictions on rabbits moving into our state. From affected states, they need to have a certificate of veterinary inspection. And some other states have followed our lead on this and have added their own requirements for rabbits entering their states. And the American Rabbit Breeders Association has limited the rabbit shows. They're not supposed to have shows within 125 miles of an active domestic case. So rabbit shows that are members of this association have to abide by that, and hopefully that will prevent spread of disease. There's been several publicly distributed news articles, and also on Easter, CBS Sunday Morning did a special on vaccinating the bunnies for rabbit hemorrhagic disease. So these are the variety of rabbits and related species out there. And that's all. So I'll take any questions if we have time for that. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Anybody have any questions for her? Darren?
Hi, Darren Taliante with the Hopi Tribes Wildlife and Ecosystems Management Program. Thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. I just had a question. Your vaccine that you're talking about, what is the plans to administer that if and once it is approved for wild populations? And I guess another question is the disease sounds like it can pretty much wipe out an entire population of wild rabbits, whether it's jackrabbits or cottontails. Based on past history in other countries, what is the recovery rate for those wildlife populations?
Well, I know that in Europe that there was, a very large mortality event in the wild rabbits, resulting in population reductions in the lynx, the Iberian lynx, which depended on them. I don't think any of the rabbit species actually became extinct because of it. Here in the United States, I know that in New Mexico, in some of the areas where the virus first appeared, the wild rabbit populations have been recovering and bouncing back. We're particularly worried about the threatened and endangered species and subspecies because they don't have the population resiliency that the other ones do. So that's why we're vaccinating the riparian brush rabbits. We've been using the French vaccine in the riparian brush rabbits, and we did a safety trial at the Oakland Zoo first. Both the French and the Spanish vaccines are a single dose vaccination. So animals considered vaccinated and after one dose. And that's helpful with wildlife populations. But with the new vaccine that's asking for approval here in the US, it's actually a 2-dose vaccine scheme which would be very difficult for wildlife populations. So we're not sure that that's going to be adaptable to the wildlife. I've also heard that Mexico is considering developing some kind of vaccine that could be used in wildlife, but their current vaccine is basically a killed vaccine from liver hemorrhagic, which is the same as the European vaccines that we're importing. But the animals have to be captured in order for the vaccine to be delivered. So they were talking about maybe some kind of oral vaccine, but I haven't heard about any progress on that. Did I answer your question?
So I guess another question is, has there been any data or studies to see how this disease relates to raptors, specifically eagles? Because, as you know, rabbits are one of their key prey-based species. And if the rabbits are dying out, and if a raptor does catch one of the rabbits, is there any possibility of the disease mutating to affect raptors?
So there's no information on the disease being able to infect birds. But certainly the concern of the lack of the food source for the birds is an important issue. And it is believed that it can pass through their GI tract intact. But yeah, there's no information on it being able to affect birds. There's been a couple papers out of Europe and also Asia suggesting that maybe European badgers can maybe become infected. And also there was a paper on musk deer possibly being able to be affected. But I'm not sure, how the peer review process on those articles has gone along. They were preliminary articles when I first saw them. So I guess I don't have the answer to that question.
Any more questions? Steve?
Yeah, maybe just a comment, and if others have knowledge of this, they could maybe weigh in on this too. But I wouldn't think that the virus would cross over to birds directly and affect birds, but in terms of predator-prey relationships, there could be, I would think, some connection with if prey populations of rabbits, for example, crash. That could affect raptors like golden eagles that might depend on those prey populations. Kind of like the cyclical predator-prey relationships that we see with other species. And I think a lot of golden eagles, for example, in the Southwest, do depend pretty significantly on rabbit populations. I don't know if that's been documented yet in terms of this disease having that kind of indirect effect, but that seems like a possibility to me. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Michelon.